To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 2, Part 3. There are no clearly defined seasons in South Alabama. Summer drifts into autumn, and autumn is sometimes never followed by winter. That fall was a long one, hardly cool enough for a light jacket. Jim and I were trotting in our orbit one mild October afternoon when our knothole stopped us again. Something white was inside. I pulled out two small images carved in soap. They were almost perfect miniatures of two children, a boy and a girl. The boy had on shorts, and a shock of soapy hair fell to his eyebrows. The girl doll wore bangs. Before I remembered that there was no such thing as hoodooing, I shrieked. Jim snatched them. "What's the matter with you? These are good. They're us." "Who did 'em, you reckon?" "Oh, we don't know anyone around here who carves," he said. The following week, the knothole yielded a tarnished medal. Jim showed it to Atticus, who said it was a spelling medal, that before we were born, the Macomb County Schools awarded such medals. Atticus said someone must have lost it, and we should ask around. Jim asked Atticus if he remembered anybody who had ever won one, and Atticus said no. Our biggest prize appeared 4 days later. It was a pocket watch that wouldn't run, on a chain with an aluminum knife. "You reckon it's white gold, Jim?" "Don't know. Maybe I can fix the watch." He did a fair job that night, only one spring and two tiny pieces left over. But the watch would not run. "Oh," he sighed, "it'll never go. Scout, you reckon we ought to write a letter to whoever's leaving us these things?" "That'd be right nice, Jim. We can thank 'em." "What's wrong?" Jim was shaking his head from side to side. "I just don't get it, Scout." He looked toward the living room. "I've got a good mind to tell Atticus." "No, I reckon not." "Scout?" He had been on the verge of telling me something all evening. His face would brighten, and he would lean toward me, and then he would change his mind. He changed it again. Oh, nothing. "Let's write the letter." I gave him a tablet and pencil. "Okay. Dear Sir, we appreciate we appreciate everything which you have put into the tree for us. Yours very truly, Jim Finch." I signed Jean Louise Finch, Scout, beneath it, and Jim put the note in an envelope. Next morning on the way to school, he ran ahead of me and stopped at the tree. "Scout!" I ran to him. He had gone white. Someone had filled our knothole with cement. "Don't you cry now, Scout. Don't cry now," he muttered at me all the way to school. When we went home for dinner, Jim bolted his food, ran to the porch, and stood on the steps. I followed him. Presently, his vigil was rewarded. "How-de-do, Mr. Nathan," he said. "Afternoon, Jim, Scout," said Mr. Radley as he went by. "Mr. Radley," said Jim. Mr. Radley turned around. "Mr. Radley, did you put cement in that hole in that tree down yonder?" "Yes," he said. "I filled it up. Tree's dying. You plug 'em with cement when they're sick. You ought to know that, Jim." Jim said nothing more. When we passed our tree, he gave it a meditative pat on its cement and remained deep in thought. We met Atticus coming home that evening, and Jim said, "Atticus, look down yonder at that tree, please, sir, the one on the corner of the Radley lot. Is that tree dying?" "Why, no, son, I don't think so. Look at the leaves." "Why?" "Mr. Nathan Radley said it was dying." "Maybe it is. I'm sure Mr. Radley knows more about his trees than we do." Atticus left us on the porch to go inside the house. Jim leaned on a pillar, rubbing his shoulders against it. "Come on in, Jim," I said. "After a while." He stood there until nightfall. When we went in the house, I saw he had been crying. His face was dirty in the right places, but I thought it odd that I had not heard him. Not long after that, for reasons unfathomable to the most experienced prophets in Macomb County, autumn turned to winter. We had 2 weeks of the coldest weather since 1885. Old Mrs. Radley died around that time, but her death caused hardly a ripple, for the neighborhood seldom saw her. Jim and I decided that Boo had got her at last, but when Atticus returned from the Radley house, he said she had died of natural causes, to our disappointment. "Atticus," I said, "did you see Mr. Arthur?" Atticus looked sternly around his newspaper. "I did not." Next morning I awoke, looked out the window, and nearly died of fright. My screams brought Atticus from his bathroom half-shaven. "The world's ending, Atticus. Do something." "No, it's not," he said. "It's snowing." Just then the phone rang and Atticus answered it. "That was Eula May," he said when he returned. I quote, "As it has not snowed in Macomb County since 1885, there will be no school today." Eula May was Macomb's leading telephone operator. She was entrusted with issuing public announcements, setting off the fire siren, and giving first aid instructions when Dr. Reynolds was away. Jim asked, "How do you make a snowman?" "I haven't the slightest idea," said Atticus. "Anyway, this is watery snow. I doubt if there'll be enough for a snowball even." After breakfast, we ran to the backyard. It was covered with a feeble layer of soggy snow. "We shouldn't walk about in it," said Jim. "Look, every step you take's wasting it." I looked at my mushy footprints. Jim said to wait until it snowed more so we could scrape it all up for a snowman. I stuck out my tongue and caught a fat flake. It burned. "Jim, it's hot." "No, it ain't. It's so cold it burns." "Now don't eat it, Scout. You're wasting it. Let it come down." "But I want to walk in it." "I know what. We can go walk over to Miss Maudie's." Jim hopped across. I followed in his tracks. "Jim Finch," Miss Maudie called, "you all stay in the middle of the yard. There's some thrift under the snow near the porch. Don't step on it." "Yes'm," called Jim. "It's beautiful, ain't it, Miss Maudie?" "Beautiful, my hind foot. If it freezes tonight, it'll carry off all my azaleas." Miss Maudie's old sun hat glistened with snow crystals. She was bending over, wrapping some small bushes in burlap bags. "Miss Maudie, could Scout and me borrow some of your snow?" "Heavens alive, take it all. There's an old peach basket under the house. Haul it off in that." After we had transferred as much snow as we could from Miss Maudie's yard to ours, a slushy operation, Jim ran to the back of the yard and began digging. When we had 5 baskets of earth and 2 baskets of snow, we succeeded in making a splendid snowman by constructing a dirt base and plastering snow on top of it. When Atticus came home for midday dinner, he was surprised when he saw so much of the backyard and the front yard, but he said we had done a Jim dandy job. The snow stopped in the afternoon, and the temperature dropped. Calpurnia kept every fireplace in the house blazing, but we were cold. That evening, Atticus put more coal on the fire in my room. He said the thermometer registered 16, the coldest in his memory, and that our snowman outside was frozen solid. Minutes later, it seemed, someone was shaking me. "Baby, get up," Atticus said. He was holding out my bathrobe and coat. Jim, groggy and tousled, was standing beside Atticus in his overcoat. Stupidly, I asked, "Is it morning?" "No, it's a little after 1. Hurry now." That something was wrong finally got through to me. "What's the matter?" But by then, he did not have to tell me. Just as the birds know where to go when it rains, I knew there was trouble in our street. Soft taffeta-like sounds and muffled scurrying sounds filled me with helpless dread. "Whose is it?" "Miss Maudie's," said Atticus gently. At the front door, we saw fire spewing from Miss Maudie's dining room windows. As if to confirm what we saw, the town fire siren wailed up the scale to a treble pitch and remained there, screaming. "Now listen, both of you," said Atticus. "Go stand in front of the Radley place. Stay there and keep out of the way. Do you hear? See which way the wind's blowing?" "Oh, Atticus, our house," Jim said. "Reckon we ought to start moving the furniture out?" "Not yet, son. Do as I tell you, and take care of Scout." With a push, Atticus started us toward the Radley front gate. We stood watching the street fill with men and cars while fire silently devoured Miss Maudie's house. "Why don't they hurry?" muttered Jim. Then we saw why. The old fire truck, killed by the cold, was being pushed from town by a crowd of men. When the men attached its hose to a hydrant, the hose burst and water shot up, tinkling down on the pavement. "Oh, Lord, Jim," I said. Jim put his arm around me. "Hush, Scout," he said. "It ain't time to worry yet. I'll let you know when." The men of Maycomb, in all degrees of dress and undress, took furniture from Miss Maudie's house to a yard across the street. I saw Atticus carrying Miss Maudie's heavy oak rocking chair. Then suddenly, I noticed that the men were backing away from Miss Maudie's house, moving down the street toward us. The fire had eaten its way to the roof. Window frames were black against a vivid orange center, like a pumpkin. "Scout, look!" Smoke was rolling off our own house like fog off a riverbank. Behind us, the fire truck from Abbotsville screamed around the curve and stopped in front of our house. The truck began pumping water on it. A man on the roof pointed to places that needed it most. I watched our snowman go black and crumble. In the heat, the men had long ago shed coats. They worked in pajama tops and nightshirts stuffed into their pants. But I became aware that I was slowly freezing where I stood. Jim tried to keep me warm, but his arm was not enough. I pulled free of it and clutched my shoulders. By dancing a little, I could feel my feet. Miss Maudie's tin roof quelled the flames. Roaring, the house collapsed. Fire gushed everywhere, followed by a flurry of blankets from men on top of the adjacent houses, beating out sparks and burning chunks of wood. It was dawn before the Maycomb truck was pushed back to town and the Abbotsville truck departed. Jim and I slid across the street. Miss Maudie was staring at the smoking black hole in her yard, and Atticus shook his head to tell us she did not want to talk. He led us home, saying Miss Maudie would stay with Miss Stephanie for the time being. "Anybody want some hot chocolate?" he asked. As we drank our cocoa, I noticed Atticus looking at me, first with curiosity, then with sternness. "I thought I told you and Jim to stay put," he said. "Well, we did." "Then whose blanket is that?" "Blanket?" I looked down and found myself clutching a brown woolen blanket around my shoulders, squaw fashion. "Atticus, I don't know, sir. I turned to Jim for an answer, but Jim was even more bewildered than I. He said he didn't know how it got there. We stayed by the Radley gate. We didn't move an inch. Jim stopped. "Mr. Nathan was at the fire," he babbled. "I saw him. He was tugging that mattress. Atticus, I swear." "That's all right, son," Atticus grinned. "Looks like all of Maycomb was out tonight in one way or another. Jim, there's some wrapping paper in the pantry. Go get it and we'll—" "Atticus, no, sir, don't send it back." Jim seemed to have lost his mind. He began pouring out our secrets left and right, omitting nothing, not whole pants and all. "Mr. Nathan put cement in that tree, Atticus, and he did it to stop us finding things. Boo's crazy, I reckon, like they say, but Atticus, he could have cut my throat that night, but he tried to mend my pants instead, and he ain't ever hurt us, Atticus." Atticus said, "Whoa, son," so gently that I was heartened. "You're right. We'd better keep the blanket to ourselves. Someday, maybe, Scout can thank him for covering her up." "Thank who?" I asked. "Boo Radley. You were so busy looking at the fire you didn't even know it when he put the blanket around you." My stomach turned to water, and I nearly threw up when Jim held out the blanket and crept toward me. He sneaked out of the house, sneaked up, and went like this. Atticus said dryly, "Do not let this inspire you to further glory, Jeremy." Jim scowled. "Well, just think, Scout," he said. "If you'd have turned around, you'd have seen him." Calpurnia woke us at noon. Atticus had said we need not go to school that day. We looked for Miss Maudie and found her in her backyard, gazing at her frozen, charred azaleas. "Miss Maudie," said Jim, "we're awfully sorry." A shadow of her old grin crossed Miss Maudie's face. "Always wanted a smaller house, Jim," she said, to our surprise. "I'll have more yard room for my azaleas now. Why, I hated that old cow barn." "How'd it catch, Miss Maudie?" Jim asked. "Oh, probably the flue in the kitchen. I kept a fire in there last night for my potted plants." Atticus tells me you had some unexpected company last night, Miss Jean Louise. Tell you the truth, I'd have liked to have been with you, Miss Maudie went on with a twinkle. And I'd have had sense enough to turn around, too.